Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Scorched Face by Dashiell Hammett. This story features the Continental Op. First published Black Mask, May 1925. If you want to read along while listening, I've added a link to the free book in the description. Here's another realistic detective tale by Mr. Hammett, formerly of the Pinkertons. It has a ring of truth in it that makes you forget that you are only reading and not actually following the San Francisco sleuth around. Chapter 1. We expected them home yesterday. Alfred Banbrock wound up his story. When they had not come by this morning, my wife telephoned Mrs. Walden. Mrs. Walden said they had not been down there, had not been expected, in fact. On the face of it then, I suggested. It seems that your daughters went away of their own accord, and are staying away on their own accord. Banbrock nodded gravely. Tired muscles sagged in his fleshy face. It would seem so, he agreed. That is why I came to your agency for help instead of going to the police. Have they ever disappeared before? No. If you read the papers and magazines, you've no doubt seen hints that the younger generation is given to irregularity. My daughters came and went pretty much as they pleased. But, though I can't say I ever knew what they were up to, we always knew where they were in a general way. Can you think of any reason for their going away like this? He shook his weary head. Any recent quarrels? I probed. He changed it to yes, although I didn't attach any importance to it, and wouldn't have recalled it if you hadn't jogged my memory. It was Thursday evening, the evening before they went away, and it was about money, of course. We never disagreed over anything else. I gave each of my daughters an adequate allowance, perhaps a very liberal one, nor did I keep them strictly within it. There were few months in which they didn't exceed it. Thursday evening they asked for an amount of money even more than usual, in excess of what two girls should need. I wouldn't give it to them, though I finally did give them a somewhat smaller amount. We didn't exactly quarrel, not in the strict sense of the word, but there was a certain lack of friendliness between us, and it was after this disagreement that they said they were going down to Mrs. Walden's in Monterey for the weekend. Possibly. I'm not sure of that point. I don't think I heard of it until the next morning, but they may have told my wife before that. I shall ask her if you wish. And you know of no other possible reason for their running away? None. I can't think that our dispute over money, by no means an unusual one, had anything to do with it. What does their mother think? Their mother is dead, Banbrock corrected me. My wife is their stepmother. She is only 2 years older than Myra, my older daughter. She is as much at sea as I. Did your daughters and their stepmother get along all right together? Yes. Excellently. If there was a division in the family, I usually found them standing together against me. Your daughters left Friday afternoon? At noon, or a few minutes after. They were going to drive down. The car, of course, is still missing. Naturally. What was it? A locomobile with a special cabriolet body. Black. You can give me the license and engine numbers? I think so. He turned in his chair to the big roll-top desk that hid a quarter of one office wall, fumbled with papers in a compartment, and read the numbers over his shoulder to me. I put them on the back of an envelope. I'm going to have this car put on the police department list of stolen machines, I told him. It can be done without mentioning your daughters. The police bulletin might find the car for us. That would help us find your daughters. Very well, he agreed, if it can be done without disagreeable publicity. As I told you at first, I don't want any more advertising than is absolutely necessary, unless it becomes likely that harm has come to the girls. I nodded understanding and got up. I want to go out and talk to your wife, I said. Is she home now? Yes, I think so. I'll phone her and tell her you are coming. Chapter 2. In a big limestone fortress on top a hill in Seacliff, looking down on ocean and bay, I had my talk with Mrs. Bambrock. She was a tall, dark girl of not more than 22 years, inclined to plumpness. She couldn't tell me anything her husband hadn't at least mentioned, but she could give me finer details. I got descriptions of the two girls. Myra, 20 years old, 5 feet 8 inches, 150 pounds, athletic, brisk, almost masculine manner and carriage, bobbed brown hair, brown eyes, medium complexion, square face, with large chin and short nose, scar over left ear, concealed by hair, fond of horses and all outdoor sports. When she left the house, she wore a blue and green wool dress, small blue hat, short black seal coat, and black slippers. Ruth, 18 years, 5 feet 4 inches, 105 pounds, brown eyes, brown bobbed hair, medium complexion, small oval face, quiet, timid, inclined to lean on her more forceful sister. When last seen, she had worn a tobacco-brown coat trimmed with brown fur over a grey silk dress and a wide brown hat. I got 2 photographs of each girl and an additional snapshot of Myra standing in front of the cabriolet. I got a list of the things they had taken with them, such things as would naturally be taken on a weekend visit. What I valued most of what I got was a list of their friends, relatives, and other acquaintances, so far as Mrs. Bambrock knew them. Did they mention Mrs. Walden's invitation before their quarrel with Mr. Bambrock? I asked, when I had my lists stowed away. I don't think so, Mrs. Bambrock said thoughtfully. I didn't connect the two things at all. They didn't really quarrel with their father, you know. It wasn't harsh enough to be called a quarrel. Did you see them when they left? Assuredly. They left at about 12:30 Friday afternoon. They kissed me as usual when they went, and there was certainly nothing in their manner to suggest anything out of the ordinary. You've no idea at all where they might have gone? None. Can't even make a guess? I can't. Among the names and addresses I have given you are some of friends and relatives of the girls in other cities. May have gone to one of those. Do you think we should? I'll take care of that, I promised. Could. You pick out 1 or 2 of them as the most likely places for the girls to have gone? She wouldn't try it. No, she said positively. I could not. From this interview I went back to the agency and put the agency machinery in motion, arranging to have operatives from some of the Continental's other branches call on the out-of-town names on my list, having the missing locomobile put on the police department list, turning 1 photograph of each girl over to a photographer to be copied. That done, I set out to talk to the persons on the list Mrs. Bambrock had given me. My first call was on a Constance Daly in an apartment building on Post Street. I saw a maid. The maid said Miss Daly was out of town. She wouldn't tell me where her mistress was or when she would be back. From there, I went up on Van Ness Avenue and found a Wayne Ferris in an automobile salesroom, a sleek-haired young man whose very nice manners and clothes completely hid anything else. Brains, for instance. He might have had. He was very willing to help me, and he knew nothing. It took him a long time to tell me so. A nice boy, another blank. Mrs. Scott is in Honolulu. In a real estate office on Montgomery Street I found my next one. Another sleek, stylish, smooth-haired young man with nice manners and nice clothes. His name was Raymond Elwood. I would have thought him a no more distant relative of Ferris than cousin if I hadn't known that the world, especially the dancing teeing world, was full of their sort. I learned nothing from him. Then I drew some more blanks. Out of town. Shopping. I don't know where you can find him. I found 1 more of the Bambrock girls' friends before I called it a day. Her name was Mrs. Stuart Carell. She lived in Presidio Terrace, not far from the Bambrocks. She was a small woman, or girl, of about Mrs. Bambrock's age. A little fluffy blonde person with wide eyes of that particular blue which always looks honest and candid no matter what is going on behind it. "I haven't seen either Ruth or Myra for 2 weeks or more," she said in answer to my question. "At that time, the last time you saw them, did either say anything about going away?" "No." Her eyes were wide and frank. A little muscle twitched in her upper lip. "And you've no idea where they might have gone?" "No." Her fingers were rolling her lace handkerchief into a little ball. "Have you heard from them since you last saw them?" "No." She moistened her mouth before she said it. "Will you give me the names and addresses of all the people you know who were also known by the Banbrock girls?" "Why? Is there?" "There's a chance that some of them may have seen them more recently than you," I explained, "or may even have seen them since Friday." Without enthusiasm, she gave me a dozen names. All were already on my list. Twice she hesitated as if about to speak a name she did not want to speak. Her eyes stayed on mine, wide and honest. Her fingers, no longer balling the handkerchief, picked at the cloth of her skirt. I didn't pretend to believe her, but my feet weren't solidly enough on the ground for me to put her on the grill. I gave her a promise before I left, one that she could get a threat out of if she liked. "Thanks very much," I said. "I know it's hard to remember things exactly. If I run across anything that will help your memory, I'll be back to let you know about it." "What?" "Yes, do," she said. Walking away from the house, I turned my head to look back just before I passed out of sight. A curtain swung into place at a second-floor window. The street lights weren't bright enough for me to be sure the curtain had swung in front of a blonde head. My watch told me it was 9:30. Too late to line up any more of the girls' friends. I went home, wrote my report for the day, and turned in, thinking more about Mrs. Corell than about the girls. She seemed worth an investigation. Chapter 3. Some telegraphic reports were in when I got to the office the next morning. None was of any value. Investigation of the names and addresses in other cities had revealed nothing. An investigation in Monterey had established reasonably, which is about as well as anything is ever established in the detecting business, that the girls had not been there recently, that the locomobile had not been there. The early editions of the afternoon papers were on the street when I went out to get some breakfast before taking up the grind where I had dropped it the previous night. I bought a paper to prop behind my grapefruit. It spoiled my breakfast for me. Banker's wife suicide. Mrs. Stuart Corell, wife of the vice president of the Golden Gate Trust Company, was found dead early this morning by her maid in her bedroom, in her home in Presidio Terrace. A bottle believed to have contained poison was on the floor beside the bed. The dead woman's husband could give no reason for his wife's suicide. He said she had not seemed depressed or... I gave my eggs and toast a quick play, put my coffee down in a lump, and got going. At the Corell residence I had to do a lot of talking before I could get to Corell. He was a tall, slim man of less than 35, with a sallow, nervous face and blue eyes that fidgeted. "I'm sorry to disturb you at a time like this," I apologized when I had finally insisted my way into his presence. "I won't take up more of your time than necessary. I am an operative of the Continental Detective Agency. I have been trying to find Ruth and Myra Banbrock, who disappeared several days ago. You know them, I think." "Yes," he said without interest. "I know them." "You knew they had disappeared?" "No." His eyes switched from a chair to a rug. "Why should I?" "Have you seen either of them recently?" I asked, ignoring his question. "Last week, Wednesday, I think. They were just leaving, standing at the door, talking to my wife, when I came home from the bank." "Didn't your wife say anything to you about their vanishing?" "No. Really, I can't tell you anything about the Mrs. Banbrock." "If you'll excuse me, just a moment longer," I said. "I wouldn't have bothered you if it hadn't been necessary. I was here last night to question Mrs. Corell. She seemed nervous. My impression was that some of her answers to my questions were, evasive. He was up out of his chair. His face was red in front of mine. "You," he cried, "I can thank you for. "Now, Mr. Corell," I tried to quiet him. "There's no use. Booth had himself all worked up. You drove my wife to her death," he accused me. "You killed her with your damned prying, with your bulldozing threats, with your—" That was silly. I felt sorry for this young man whose wife had killed herself. Apart from that, I had work to do. I tightened the screws. "We won't argue, Corell," I told him. "The point is that I came here to see if your wife could tell me anything about the Banbrocks. She told me less than the truth. Later, she committed suicide. I want to know why. Come through for me, and I'll do what I can to keep the papers and the public from linking her death with the girl's disappearance." "Linking her death with their disappearance?" he exclaimed. "That's absurd." "Maybe, but the connection is there," I hammered away at him. I felt sorry for him, but I had work to do. "It's there. If you'll give it to me, maybe it won't have to be advertised." "I'm going to get it, though. You give it to me, or I'll go after it out in the open." For a moment I thought he was going to take a poke at me. I wouldn't have blamed him. His body stiffened, then sagged, and he dropped back into his chair. His eyes fidgeted away from mine. "There's nothing I can tell," he mumbled. "When her maid went to her room to call her this morning, she was dead. There was no message, no reason, nothing." "Did you see her last night?" "No, I was not home for dinner. I came in late and went straight to my own room, not wanting to disturb her. I hadn't seen her since I left the house that morning." "Did she seem disturbed or worried then?" "No." "Why do you think she did it?" "My God, man, I don't know. I've thought and thought, but I don't know." "Health?" "She seemed well. She was never ill, never complained." "Any recent quarrels?" "We never quarreled. Never in the year and a half we have been married. Financial trouble." He shook his head without speaking or looking up from the floor. "Any other worry?" He shook his head again. "Did the maid notice anything peculiar in her behavior last night?" "Nothing." "Have you looked through her things? For papers? Letters?" "Yes, and found nothing." He raised his head to look at me. "The only thing—" He spoke very slowly. There was a little pile of ashes in the grate in her room, as if she had burned papers or letters. Corell held nothing more for me. Nothing I could get out of him anyway. The girl at the front gate in Alfred Banbrock's Shoreman's building suite told me he was in conference. I sent my name in. He came out of conference to take me into his private office. His tired face was full of questions. I didn't keep him waiting for the answers. He was a grown man. I didn't edge around the bad news. "Things have taken a bad break," I said as soon as we were locked in together. "I think we'll have to go to the police and newspapers for help. Mrs. Corell, a friend of your daughter's, lied to me when I questioned her yesterday. Last night she committed suicide." "Irma Corell? Suicide? You knew her?" "Yes, intimately." "She was. That is, she was a close friend of my wife and daughter's." "She killed herself?" "Yes, poison. Last night." "Where does she fit in with your daughter's disappearance?" "Where?" he repeated. "I don't know." "Must she fit in?" "I think she must. She told me she hadn't seen your daughters for a couple of weeks. Her husband told me just now that they were talking to her when he came home from the bank last Wednesday afternoon. She seemed nervous when I questioned her. She killed herself shortly afterward. There's hardly a doubt that she fits in somewhere." "And that means?" "That means," I finished for him, "that your daughters may be perfectly safe, but that we can't afford to gamble on that possibility. You think harm has come to them?" "I don't think anything," I evaded, "except that with a death tied up closely with their going, we can't afford to play around." Banbrock got his attorney on the phone, a pink-faced, white-haired old boy named Norwell, who had the reputation of knowing more about corporations than all the Morgans, but who hadn't the least idea as to what police procedure was all about, and told him to meet us at the Hall of Justice. We spent an hour and a half there, getting the police turned loose on the affair, and giving the newspapers what we wanted them to have. That was plenty of dope on the girls, plenty of photographs and so forth, but nothing about the connection between them and Mrs. Corell. Of course we let the police in on that angle. Chapter 4. After Banbrock and his attorney had gone away together, I went back to the detectives' assembly room to chew over the job with Pat Reddy, the police sleuth assigned to it. Pat was the youngest member of the detective bureau, a big blonde Irishman who went in for the spectacular in his lazy way. A couple of years ago he was a new copper pounding his feet in harness on a hillside beat. One night he tagged an automobile that was parked in front of a fire plug. The owner came out just then and gave him an argument. She was Althea Wallach, only and spoiled daughter of the owner of the Wallach Coffee Company, a slim, reckless youngster with hot eyes. She must have told Pat plenty. He took her over to the station and dumped her in a cell. Old Wallach, so the story goes, showed up the next morning with a full head of steam and half the lawyers in San Francisco. But Pat made his charge stick, and the girl was fined. Old Wallach did everything but take a punch at Pat in the corridor afterward. Pat grinned his sleepy grin at the coffee importer and drawled, "You better lay off me, or I'll stop drinking your coffee." That crack got into most of the newspapers in the country, and even into a Broadway show. But Pat didn't stop with the snappy comeback. 3 days later, he and Althea Wallach went over to Alameda and got themselves married. I was in on that part. I happened to be on the ferry they took, and they dragged me along to see the deed done. Old Wallach immediately disowned his daughter, but that didn't seem to worry anybody else. Pat went on pounding his beat, but now that he was conspicuous, it wasn't long before his qualities were noticed. He was boosted into the detective bureau. Old Wallach relented before he died, and left Althea both of his millions. Pat took the afternoon off to go to the funeral, and went back to work that night catching a wagon load of gunmen. He kept on working. I don't know what his wife did with her money, but Pat didn't even improve the quality of his cigars, though he should have. He lived now in the Wallach mansion, true enough, and now and then on rainy mornings he would be driven down to the hall in a Hispano Suiza brougham, but there was no difference in him beyond that. That was the big blonde Irishman who sat across a desk from me in the assembly room and fumigated me with something shaped like a cigar. He took the cigar-like thing out of his mouth presently and spoke through the fumes. "This Corell woman you think's tied up with the Banbrocks. She was stuck up a couple of months back and nicked for $800. Know that? I hadn't known it. Lose anything besides cash? I asked. No. You believe it? He grinned. That's the point, he said. We didn't catch the bird who did it. With women who lose things that way, especially money, it's always a question whether it's a hold-up or a hold-out. He teased some more poison gas out of the cigar thing, and added, the hold-up might have been on the level, though. What are you figuring on doing now? Let's go up to the agency and see if anything new has turned up. Then I'd like to talk to Mrs. Banbrock again. Maybe she can tell us something about the Corell woman. At the office, I found that reports had come in on the rest of the out-of-town names and addresses. Apparently, none of these people knew anything about the girl's whereabouts. Reddy and I went on up to Seacliff, to the Banbrock home. Banbrock had telephoned the news of Mrs. Corell's death to his wife, and she had read the papers. She told us she could think of no reason for the suicide. She could imagine no possible connection between the suicide and her stepdaughter's vanishing. Mrs. Corell seemed as nearly contented and happy as usual the last time I saw her, 2 or 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Banbrock said. Of course she was by nature inclined to be dissatisfied with things, but not to the extent of doing a thing like this. Do you know of any trouble between her and her husband? No. So far as I know, they were happy, though. She broke off. Hesitancy, embarrassment showed in her dark eyes. Though? I repeated. If I don't tell you now, you'll think I am hiding something, she said, flushing, and laughing a little laugh that held more nervousness than amusement. It hasn't any bearing, but I was always just a little jealous of Irma. She and my husband were. Well, everyone thought they would marry. That was a little before he and I married. I never let it show, and I dare say it was a foolish idea. But I always had a suspicion that Irma married Stuart more in pique than for any other reason, and that she was still fond of Alfred, Mr. Bambrock. Was there anything definite to make you think that? No, nothing. Really, I never thoroughly believed it. It was just a sort of vague feeling. Cattiness, no doubt, more than anything else. It was getting along toward evening when Pat and I left the Bambrock house. Before we knocked off for the day, I called up the old man, the Continental San Francisco branch manager, and therefore my boss, and asked him to sic an operative on Irma Correll's past. I took a look at the morning papers, thanks to their custom of appearing almost as soon as the sun is out of sight, before I went to bed. They had given our job a good spread. All the facts except those having to do with the Correll angle were there, plus photographs, and the usual assortment of guesses in similar garbage. The following morning I went after the friends of the missing girls to whom he had not yet talked. I found some of them, and got nothing of value from them. Late in the morning I telephoned the office to see if anything new had turned up. It had. "We've just had a call from the sheriff's office at Martinez," the old man told me. "An Italian grape grower near Knob Valley picked up a charred photograph a couple of days ago and recognized it as Ruth Bambrock when he saw her picture in this morning's paper. Will you get up there? A deputy sheriff and the Italian are waiting for you in the Knob Valley marshal's office." "I'm on my way," I said. At the ferry building, I used the 4 minutes before my boat left trying to get Pat ready on the phone, with no success. Knob Valley is a town of less than 1,000 people, a dreary, dirty town in Contra Costa County. A San Francisco-Sacramento local sent me down there while the afternoon was still young. I knew the marshal slightly, Tom Orth. I found 2 men in the office with him. Orth introduced us. Abner Paget, a gawky man of 40-something, with a slack chin, scrawny face, and pale, intelligent eyes, was the deputy sheriff. Gio Serigino, the Italian grape grower, was a small, nut-brown man with strong yellow teeth that showed in an everlasting smile under his black mustache and soft brown eyes. Paget showed me the photograph, a scorched piece of paper the size of a $50, apparently all that had not been burned of the original picture. It was Ruth Bambrock's face. There was little room for doubting that. She had a peculiarly excited, almost drunken, look, and her eyes were larger than in the other pictures of her I had seen. But it was her face. "He says he found it day 4 yesterday," Paget explained dryly, nodding at the Italian. "The wind blew it against his foot when he was walking up a piece of road near his place. He picked it up and stuck it in his pocket, he says. For no special reason, I guess, except maybe that guineas like pictures." He paused to regard the Italian meditatively. The Italian nodded his head in vigorous affirmation. "Anyways," the deputy sheriff went on, "he was in town this morning and seen the pictures in the papers from Frisco, so he come in here and told Tom about it. Tom and me decided the best thing was to phone your agency, since the paper said you was working on it." I looked at the Italian. Paget, reading my mind, explained, "Serigino lives over in the hills, got a grape ranch there. Been around here 5 or 6 years, and ain't killed nobody that I know of." "Remember the place where you found the picture?" I asked the Italian. His grin broadened under his mustache, and his head went up and down. "For sure I remember that place." "Let's go there," I suggested to Paget. "Right. Coming along, Tom?" The marshal said he couldn't. He had something to do in town. Serigino, Paget and I went out and got into a dusty Ford that the deputy sheriff drove. We rode for nearly an hour, along a county road that bent up the slope of Mount Diablo. After a while, at a word from the Italian, we left the county road for a dustier and ruttier one a mile off this one. "This place," Serigino said. Paget stopped the Ford. We got out in a clearing. The trees and bushes that had crowded the road retreated here for 20 feet or so on either side, leaving a little dusty circle in the woods. "About this place," the Italian was saying. "I think by this stump, but between that bend ahead and that one behind I know for sure." Chapter 5. Paget was a countryman. I am not. I waited for him to move. He looked around the clearing slowly, standing still between the Italian and me. His pale eyes lighted presently. He went around the ford to the far side of the clearing. Serigino and I followed. Near the fringe of brush at the edge of the clearing, the scrawny deputy stopped to grunt at the ground. The wheel marks of an automobile were there. A car had turned around here. Paget went on into the woods. The Italian kept close to his heels. I brought up the rear. Paget was following some sort of track. I couldn't see it, either because he and the Italian blotted it out ahead of me, or because I'm a shine Indian. We went back quite a way. Paget stopped. The Italian stopped. Paget said, "Uh-huh," as if he had found an expected thing. The Italian said something with the name of God in it. I trampled a bush, coming beside them to see what they saw. I saw it. At the base of a tree, on her side, her knees drawn up close to her body, a girl was dead. She wasn't nice to see. Birds had been at her. A tobacco-brown coat was half on, half off her shoulders. I knew she was Ruth Banbrock before. I turned her over to look at the side of her face the ground had saved from the bird. Serigino stood watching me while I examined the girl. His face was mournful in a calm way. The deputy sheriff paid little attention to the body. He was off in the brush, moving around, looking at the ground. He came back as I finished my examination. "Shot," I told him, "once in the right temple. Before that, I think, there was a fight. There are marks on the arm that was under her body. There's nothing on her. No jewelry, money, nothing." "That goes," Paget said. "2 women got out of the car back in the clearing. Anne came here. Could have been 3 women if the others carried this one. Can't make out how many went back. One of them was larger than this one. There was a scuffle here. Find the gun?" "No," I said. "Neither did I. It went away in the car then. There's what's left of a fire over there." He ducked his head to the left. "Paper and rags burnt. Not enough left to do us any good. I reckon the photo Serigino found blew away from the fire. Late Friday, I'd put it, or maybe Saturday morning. No nearer than that." I took the deputy sheriff's word for it. He seemed to know his stuff. "Come here, I'll show you something," he said, and led me over to a little black pile of ashes. He hadn't anything to show me. He wanted to talk to me away from the Italian's ears. "I think the guinea's all right," he said, "but I reckon I'd best hold him a while to make sure. This is some way from his place." And he stuttered a little bit too much, telling me how he happened to be passing here. Course, that don't mean nothing much. All these guineas peddle vino, and I guess that's what brought him out this way. I'll hold him a day or 2 anyways. "Good," I agreed. "This is your country, and you know the people. Can you visit around and see what you can pick up? Whether anybody saw anything? Saw a locomobile cabriolet? Or anything else? You can get more than I could." "I'll do that," he promised. "All right, then I'll go back to San Francisco now." "I suppose you'll want to camp here with the body." "Yeah, you drive the Ford back to Knob Valley and tell Tom what's what. He'll come or send out. I'll keep the guinea here with me." Waiting for the next westbound train out of Knob Valley, I got the office on the telephone. The old man was out. I told my story to one of the office men and asked him to get the news to the old man as soon as he could. Everybody was in the office when I got back to San Francisco. Alfred Banbrock, his face a pink grey that was deader than solid grey could have been. His pink and white old lawyer, Pat Reddy, sprawled on his spine with his feet on another chair. The old man, with his gentle eyes behind gold spectacles and his mild smile, hiding the fact that 50 years of sleuthing had left him without any feelings at all on any subject. Whitey. Clayton used to say the old man could spit icicles in August. Nobody said anything when I came in. I said my say as briefly as possible. Then the other woman, the woman who killed Ruth, was. Banbrock didn't finish his question. Nobody answered it. "We don't know what happened," I said after a while. Your daughter and someone we don't know may have gone there. Your daughter may have been dead before she was taken there. She may have, but Myra. Banbrock was pulling at his collar with a finger inside. Where is Myra? I couldn't answer that, nor could any of the others. You are going up Knob Valley now, I asked him. Yes, at once. You will come with me? I wasn't sorry I could not. No, there are things to be done here. I'll give you a note to the marshal. I want you to look carefully at the piece of your daughter's photograph the Italian found, to see if you remember it. Banbrock and the lawyer left. Chapter 6. Reddy lit one of his awful cigars. We found the car, the old man said. Where? In Sacramento. It was left in a garage there either late Friday night or early Saturday. Foley has gone up to investigate it, and Reddy has uncovered a new angle. Pat nodded through his smoke. A hock shop dealer came in this morning, Pat said, and told us that Myra Banbrock and another girl came to his joint last week and hocked a lot of stuff. They gave him phony names, but he swears one of them was Myra. He recognized her picture as soon as he saw it in the paper. Her companion wasn't Ruth. It was a little blonde. Mrs. Carell? Uh-huh. The shark can't swear to that, but I think that's the answer. Some of the jewelry was Myra's, some Ruth's, and some we don't know. I mean, we can't prove it belonged to Mrs. Carell, though we'll. When did all this happen? They soaked the stuff Monday before they went away. Have you seen Carell? Uh-huh, Pat said. I did a lot of talking to him, but the answers weren't worth much. He says he don't know whether any of her jewelry is gone or not and doesn't care. It was hers, he says, and she could do anything she wanted with it. He was kind of disagreeable. I got along a little better with one of the maids. She says some of Mrs. Carell's pretties disappeared last week. Mrs. Carell said she had lent them to a friend. I'm going to show the stuff the hock shop has to the maid tomorrow, to see if she can identify it. She didn't know anything else, except that Mrs. Carell was out of the picture for a while on Friday, the day the Banbrock girls went away. What do you mean, out of the picture? I asked. She went out late in the morning and didn't show up until somewhere around 3 the next morning. She and Carell had a row over it, but she wouldn't tell him where she had been. I liked that. It could mean something. And, Pat went on, Carell has just remembered that his wife had an uncle who went crazy in Pittsburgh in 1902, and that she had a morbid fear of going crazy herself, and that she'd often said she would kill herself if she thought she was going crazy. Wasn't it nice of him to remember those things at last? To account for her death? It was, I agreed, but it doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't even prove that he knows anything. Now my guess is... To hell with your guess, Pat said, getting up and pushing his hat in place. Your guesses all sound like a lot of static to me. I'm going home, eat my dinner, read my Bible, and go to bed. I suppose he did. Anyway, he left us. We all might as well have spent the next 3 days in bed for all the profit that came out of our running around. No place we visited, nobody we questioned, added to our knowledge. We were in Ablind Alley. We learned that the locomobile was left in Sacramento by Myra Banbrock and not by anyone else, but we didn't learn where she went afterward. We learned that some of the jewelry in the pawn shop was Mrs. Carell's. The locomobile was brought back from Sacramento. Mrs. Carell was buried. Ruth Banbrock was buried. The newspapers found other mysteries. Reddy and I dug and dug, and all we brought up was dirt. The following Monday brought me close to the end of my rope. There seemed nothing more to do but sit back and hope that the circulars with which we had plastered North America would bring results. Reddy had already been called off and put to running out fresher trails. I hung on because Banbrock wanted me to keep at it so long as there was the shadow of anything to keep at. But by Monday I had worked myself out. Before going to Banbrock's office to tell him I was licked, I dropped in at the Hall of Justice to hold a wake over the job with Pat Reddy. He was crouched over his desk, writing a report on some other job. "Hello," he greeted me, pushing his report away and smearing it with ashes from his cigar. "How did the Banbrock doings?" "They don't," I admitted. It doesn't seem possible, with the stack up what it is, that we should have come to a dead stop. It's there for us if we can find it. The need of money before both the Banbrock and the Corell calamities. Mrs. Corell's suicide after I had questioned her about the girls, her burning things before she died, and the burning of things immediately before or after Ruth Banbrock's death. Maybe the trouble is, Pat suggested, that you're not such a good sleuth. Maybe. We smoked in silence for a minute or two after that insult. You understand, Pat said presently, there doesn't have to be any connection between the Banbrock death and disappearance and the Corell death. Maybe not. But there has to be a connection between the Banbrock death and the Banbrock disappearance. There was a connection, in a pawn shop, between the Banbrock and Corell actions before these things. If there is that connection, then... I broke off, all full of ideas. What's the matter? Pat asked. Swallow your gum? Listen, I let myself get almost enthusiastic. We've got what happened to 3 women hooked up together. If we could tie up some more in the same string, I want the names and addresses of all the women and girls in San Francisco who've committed suicide, been murdered, or have disappeared within the past year. You think this is a wholesale deal? I think the more we can tie up together, the more lines we'll have to run out. And they can't all lead nowhere. Let's get our list, Pat. We spent all the afternoon and most of the night getting it. Its size would have embarrassed the Chamber of Commerce. It looked like a hunk of the telephone book. Things happen in a city in a year. The section devoted to strayed wives and daughters was the largest, suicides next, and even the smallest division, murders, wasn't any too short. We could check off most of the names against what the police department had already learned of them and their motives, weeding out those positively accounted for in a manner nowadays connected with our present interest. The remainder we split into 2 classes, those of unlikely connection and those of more possible connection. Even then, the second list was longer than I had expected, or hoped. There were 6 suicides in it, 3 murders and 21 disappearances. Reddy had other work to do. I put the list in my pocket and went calling. Chapter 7. For 4 days I ground at the list. I hunted, found, questioned, and investigated friends and relatives of the women and girls on my list. My questions all hit in the same direction. Had she been acquainted with Myra Banbrock? Ruth? Mrs. Corell? Had she been in need of money before her death or disappearance? Had she destroyed anything before her death or disappearance? Had she known any of the other women on my list? 3 times I drew yeses. Sylvia Varney, a girl of 20, who had killed herself on November 5th, had drawn $600 from the bank the week before her death. No, one in her family could say what she had done with the money. A friend of Sylvia Varney's, Ada Youngman, a married woman of 25 or 6, had disappeared on December 2nd and was still gone. The Varney girl had been at Mrs. Youngman's home an hour before she, the Varney girl, killed herself. Mrs. Dorothy Sorden, a young widow, had shot herself on the night of January 13th. No trace was found of either the money her husband had left her or the funds of a club whose treasurer she was. A bulky letter her maid remembered having given her that afternoon was never found. These 3 women's connection with the Banbrock-Corell affair was sketchy enough. None of them had done anything that isn't done by 9 out of 10 women who killed themselves or run away. But the troubles of all 3 had come to a head within the past few months, and all 3 were women of about the same financial and social position as Mrs. Corell and the Banbrocks. Finishing my list with no fresh leads, I came back to these 3. I had the names and addresses of 62 friends of the Banbrock girls. I set about getting the same sort of catalogue on the 3 women I was trying to bring into the game. I didn't have to do all the digging myself. Fortunately, there were 2 or 3 operatives in the office with nothing else to do just then. We got something. Mrs. Sorden had known Raymond Elwood. Sylvia Varney had known Raymond Elwood. There was nothing to show Mrs. Youngman had known him, but it was likely she had. She and the Varney girl had been thick. I had already interviewed this Raymond Elwood in connection with the Banbrock girls, but had paid no especial attention to him. I had considered him just one of the sleek-headed, high-polished young men of whom there was quite a few listed. I went back at him, all interest now. The results were promising. He had, as I have said, a real estate office on Montgomery Street. We were unable to find a single client he had ever served, or any signs of one's existence. He had an apartment out in the Sunset District where he lived alone. His local records seemed to go back no farther than 10 months, though we couldn't find its definite starting point. Apparently, he had no relatives in San Francisco. He belonged to a couple of fashionable clubs. He was vaguely supposed to be well connected in the East. He spent money. I couldn't shadow Elwood, having too recently interviewed him. Dick Foley did. Elwood was seldom in his office during the first 3 days Dick tailed him. He was seldom in the financial district. He visited his clubs, he danced and teared and so forth, and each of those 3 days he visited a house on Telegraph Hill. The first afternoon Dick had him, Elwood went to the Telegraph Hill house with a tall, fair girl from Burlingame. The second day, in the evening, with a plump young woman who came out of a house out on Broadway. The third evening with a very young girl who seemed to live in the same building as he. Usually Elwood and his companion spent from 3 to 4 hours in the house on Telegraph Hill. Other people, all apparently well-to-do, went in and out of the house while it was under Dick's eye. I climbed Telegraph Hill to give the house the up and down. It was a large house, a big frame house painted egg yellow. It hung dizzily on a shoulder of the hill, a shoulder that was sharp where rock had been quarried away. The house seemed about to go skiing down on the roofs far below. It had no immediate neighbors. The approach was screened by bushes and trees. I gave that section of the hill a good strong play, calling at all the houses within shooting distance of the yellow one. Nobody knew anything about it, or about its occupants. The folks on the hill aren't a curious lot, perhaps because most of them have something to hide on their own account. My climbing uphill and downhill got me nothing until I succeeded in learning who owned the yellow house. The owner was an estate whose affairs were in the hands of the West Coast Trust Company. I took my investigations to the Trust Company, with some satisfaction. The house had been leased 8 months ago by Raymond Elwood, acting for a client named T.F. Maxwell. We couldn't find Maxwell. We couldn't find anybody who knew Maxwell. We couldn't find any evidence that Maxwell was anything but a name. One of the operatives went up to the yellow house on the hill and rang the bell for half an hour with no result. We didn't try that again, not wanting to stir things up at this stage. I made another trip up the hill, house hunting. I couldn't find a place as near the yellow house as I would have liked, but I succeeded in renting a 3-room flat from which the approach to it could be watched. Dick and I camped in the flat, with Pat ready when he wasn't off on other duties, and watched machines turn into the screened path that led to the egg-tinted house. Afternoon and night there were machines. Most of them carried women. We saw no one we could place as a resident of the house. Elwood came daily, once alone, the other time with women whose faces we couldn't see from our window. We shadowed some of the visitors away. They were without exception reasonably well off financially, and some were socially prominent. We didn't go up against any of them with talk. Even a carefully planned pretext is as likely as not to tip your mitt when you're up against a blind game. 3 days of this, and our break came. It was early evening, just dark. Pat Reddy had phoned that he had been up on a job for 2 days and a night, and was going to sleep clock around. Dick and I were sitting at the window of our flat, watching automobiles turn toward the yellow house, writing down their license numbers as they passed through the blue-white patch of light and arc lamp put in the road just beyond our window. A woman came climbing the hill, afoot. She was a tall woman, strongly built. A dark veil, not thick enough to advertise the fact that she wore it to hide her features, nevertheless did hide them. Her way was up the hill, past our flat, on the other side of the roadway. A night wind from the Pacific was creaking a grocer's sign down below, swaying the arc light above. The wind caught the woman as she passed out of our building's sheltered area, coat and skirts tangled. She put her back to the wind, a hand to her hat. Her veil whipped out straight from her face. Her face was a face from a photograph. Myra Banbrock's face. Dick made her with me. "Our baby," he cried, bouncing to his feet. "Wait," I said. "She's going into the joint on the edge of the hill. Let her go. We'll go after her when she's inside." That's our excuse for frisking the joint. I went into the next room where our telephone was and called Pat Reddy's number. "She didn't go in," Dick called from the window. "She went past the path." "After her," I ordered. "There's no sense to that." "What's the matter with her?" I felt sort of indignant about it. "She's got to go in. Taylor, I'll find you after I get Pat." Dick went. Pat's wife answered the telephone. I told her who I was. "Will you shake Pat out of the covers and send him up here? He knows where I am. Tell him I want him in a hurry." "I will," she promised. "I'll have him there in 10 minutes, wherever it is." Outdoors, I went up the road, hunting for Dick and Myra Banbrock. Neither was in sight. Passing the bushes that masked the yellow house, I went on, circling down a stony path to the left. No sign of either. I turned back in time to see Dick going into our flat. I followed. "She's in," he said when I joined him. She went up the road, cut across through some bushes, came back to the edge of the cliff, and slid feet first through a cellar window. That was nice. The crazier the people you are sleuthing at, as a rule, the nearer you are to an ending of your troubles. Reddy arrived within a minute or two of the time his wife had promised. He came in buttoning his clothes. "What the hell did you tell Althea?" he growled at me. She gave me an overcoat to put over my pajamas, dumped the rest of my clothes in the car, and I had to get in them on the way over. "I'll cry with you after a while." I dismissed his troubles. "Myra Banbrock just went into the joint through a cellar window. Elwood. Has been there an hour. Let's knock it off." "Pat is deliberate. We ought to have papers even at that," he stalled. "Sure," I agreed. "But you can get them fixed up afterward. That's what you're here for. Contra Costa County wants her, maybe to try her for murder. That's all the excuse we need to get into the joint. We go there for her. If we happen to run into anything else, well and good." Pat finished buttoning his vest. "Oh, all right," he said sourly. "Have it your way, but if you get me smashed for searching a house without authority, you'll have to give me a job with your law-breaking agency." "I will." I turned to Foley. "You'll have to stay outside, Dick. Keep your eye on the getaway. Don't bother anybody else, but if the Banbrock girl gets out, stay behind her." "I expected it," Dick howled. "Anytime there's any fun, I can count on being stuck off somewhere on a street corner." Chapter 8. Pat Reddy and I went straight up the bush-hidden path to the yellow house's front door and rang the bell. A big black man in a red fez, red silk jacket over red striped silk shirt, red zouave pants and red slippers opened the door. He filled the opening, framed in the black of the hall behind him. "Is Mr. Maxwell home?" I asked. The black man shook his head and said words in a language I don't know. "Mr. Elwood, then?" Another shaking of the head, more strange language. "Let's see whoever is home, then," I insisted. Out of the jumble of words that meant nothing to me, I picked 3 in garbled English, which he thought were master, not, and home. The door began to close. I put a foot against it. Pat flashed his buzzer. Though the black man had poor English, he had knowledge of police badges. One of his feet stamped on the floor behind him. A gong boomed deafeningly in the rear of the house. The black man bent his weight to the door. My weight on the foot that blocked the door, I leaned sidewise, swaying to the Negro. Slamming from the hip, I put my fist in the middle of him. Reddy hit the door, and we went into the hall. "'Fore God, Fat Shorty," the black man gasped in good black Virginian, "you done hurt me." Reddy and I went by him, down the hall whose bounds were lost in darkness. The bottom of a flight of steps stopped my feet. A gun went off upstairs. It seemed to point at us. We didn't get the bullets. A babel of voices, women screaming, men shouting, came and went upstairs, came and went as if a door was being opened and shut. "Up, my boy," Reddy yelped in my ear. We went up the stairs. We didn't find the man who had shot at us. At the head of the stairs, a door was locked. Reddy's bulk forced it. We came into a bluish light, a large room, all purple and gold, confusion of overturned furniture and rumpled rugs. A grey slipper lay near a far door. A green silk gown was in the centre of the floor. No person was there. I raced Pat to the curtained door beyond the slipper. The door was not locked. Reddy yanked it wide. A room with 3 girls and a man crouching in a corner, fear in their faces. Neither of them was Myra Banbrock or Raymond Elwood or anyone we knew. Our glances went away from them after the first quick look. The open door across the room grabbed our attention. The door gave to a small room. The room was chaos. A small room packed and tangled with bodies. Live bodies. Seething, writhing. The room was a funnel into which men and women had been poured. Boiled noisily toward the one small window that was the funnel's outlet. Men and women, youths and girls, screaming, struggling, squirming, fighting. Some had no clothes. "We'll get through and block the window," Pat yelled in my ear. "Like hell," I began, but he was gone ahead into the confusion. I went after him. I didn't mean to block the window. I meant to save Pat from his foolishness. No 5 men could have fought through that boiling turmoil of maniacs. No, 10 men could have turned them from the window. Pat, big as he is, was down when I got to him. A half-dressed girl, a child, was driving at his face with sharp high heels. Hands, feet, were tearing him apart. I cleared him with a play of gun barrel on shins and wrists, dragged him back. "Myra's not I yelled into his ear as I helped him up. "Elwood's not there." I wasn't sure, but I hadn't seen them, and I doubted that they would be in this mess. These savages, boiling again to the window, with no attention for us, whoever they were, weren't insiders. They were the mob, and the principals shouldn't be among them. "We'll try the other rooms," I yelled again. "We don't want these." Pat rubbed the back of his hand across his torn face and laughed. "It's a cinch I don't want 'em anymore," he said. We went back to the head of the stairs the way we had come. We saw no one. The man and girls who had been in the next room were gone. At the head of the stairs we paused. There was no noise behind us except the now fainter babel of the lunatics fighting for their exit. A door shut sharply downstairs. A body came out of nowhere, hit my back, flattened me to the landing. The feel of silk was on my cheek. A brawny hand was fumbling at my throat. I bent my wrist until my gun, upside down, lay against my cheek. Praying for my ear, I squeezed. My cheek took fire. My head was a roaring thing, about to burst. The silk slid away. Pat hauled me upright. We started down the stairs. Swish! A thing came past my face, stirring my bared hair. 1,000 pieces of glass, china, plaster, exploded upward at my feet. I tilted head and gun together. A Negro's red silk arms were still spread over the balustrade above. I sent him 2 bullets. Pat sent him 2. The Negro teetered over the rail. He came down on us, arms outflung, a dead man's swan dive. We scurried down the stairs from under him. He shook the house when he landed, but we weren't watching him then. The smooth, sleek head of Raymond Elwood took our attention. In the light from above, it showed for a furtive split second around the newel post at the foot of the stairs. Showed and vanished. Pat Reddy, closer to the rail than I, went over it in a one-hand vault down into the blackness below. I made the foot of the stairs in 2 jumps, jerked myself around with a hand on the newel, and plunged into the suddenly noisy dark of the hall. A wall I couldn't see hit me. Caroming off the opposite wall, I spun into a room whose curtain greyness was the light of day after the hall. Chapter 9. Pat Reddy stood with one hand on a chair back, holding his belly with the other. His face was mouse-coloured under its blood. His eyes were glass agonies. He had the look of a man who had been kicked. The grin he tried failed. He nodded toward the rear of the house. I went back. In a little passageway I found Raymond Elwood. He was sobbing and pulling frantically at a locked door. His face was hard white of utter terror. I measured the distance between us. He turned as I jumped. I put everything I had in the downswing of my gun barrel. A ton of meat and bone crashed into my back. I went over against the wall, breathless, giddy, sick. Red silk arms that ended in brown hands locked around me. I wondered if there was a whole regiment of these gaudy Negroes, or if I was colliding with the same one over and over. This one didn't let me do much thinking. He was big. He was strong. He didn't mean any good. My gun arm was flat at my side, straight down. I tried a shot at one of the Negro's feet. Missed. Tried again. He moved his feet. I wriggled around, half facing him. Elwood piled on my other side. The Negro bent me backward, folding me spine on itself like an accordion. I fought to hold my knees stiff. Too much weight was hanging on me. My knees sagged. My body curved back. Pat Reddy, swaying in the doorway, shone over the Negro's shoulder like the angel Gabriel. Grey pain was in Pat's face, but his eyes were clear. His right hand held a gun. His left was getting a blackjack out of his hip pocket. He swung sap down on the Negro's shaven skull. The black man wheeled away from me, shaking his head. Pat hit him once more before the Negro closed with him, hit him full in the face, but couldn't beat him off. Twisting my freed gun hand up, I drilled Elwood neatly through the chest and let him slide down me to the floor. The Negro had Pat against the wall, bothering him a lot. His broad-red back was a target. But I had used 5 of the 6 bullets in my gun. I had more in my pocket, but reloading takes time. I stepped out of Elwood's feeble hands and went to work with the flat of my gun on the Negro. There was a roll of fat where his skull and neck fit together. The third time I hit it, he flopped, taking Pat with him. I rolled him off. The blonde police detective, Noffery blonde now, got up. At the other end of the passageway, an open door showed an empty kitchen. Pat and I went to the door that Elwood had been playing with. It was a solid piece of carpentering and neatly fastened. Yoking ourselves together, we began to beat the door with our combined 370 or 80 pounds. It shook, but held. We hit it again. Wood we couldn't see tore. Again. The door popped away from us. We went through, down a flight of steps, rolling, snowballing down, until a cement floor stopped us. Pat came back to life first. "You're a hell of an acrobat," he said. "Get off my neck." I stood up. He stood up. We seemed to be dividing the evening between falling on the floor and getting up from the floor. A light switch was at my shoulder. I turned it on. If I looked anything like Pat, we were a fine pair of nightmares. It was all raw meat and dirt, with not enough clothes left to hide much of either. I didn't like his looks, so I looked around the basement in which we stood. To the rear was a furnace, coal bins and a woodpile. To the front was a hallway and rooms, after the manner of the upstairs. The first door we tried was locked, but not strongly. We smashed through it into a photographer's dark room. The second door was unlocked and put us in a chemical laboratory, retorts, tubes, burners, and a small still. There was a little round iron stove in the middle of the room. No one was there. We went out into the hallway into the third door, not so cheerfully. This cellar looked like a bloomer. We were wasting our time here when we should have stayed upstairs. I tried the door. It was firm beyond trembling. We smacked it with our weight together experimentally. It didn't shake. "Wait!" Pat went to the woodpile in the rear and came back with an axe. He swung the axe against the door, flaking out a hunk of wood. Silvery points of light sparkled in the hole. The other side of the door was an iron or steel plate. Pat put the axe down and leaned on the helve. "You write the next prescription," he said. "I didn't have anything to suggest except, I'll camp here. You beat it upstairs and see if any of your coppers have shown up. This is a God-forsaken hole, but somebody may have sent in an alarm. See if you can find another way into this room. A window, maybe, or manpower enough to get us in through this door." Pat turned toward the steps. A sound stopped him, the clicking of bolts on the other side of the iron-lined door. A jump put Pat on one side of the frame. A step put me on the other. Slowly the door moved in. Too slowly. I kicked it open. Pat and I went into the room. On top of my kick, his shoulder hit the woman. I managed to catch her before she fell. Pat took her gun. I steadied her back on her feet. Her face was a pale blank square. She was Myra Banbrock, but she now had none of the masculinity that had been in her photographs and description. Steadying her with one arm, which also served to block her arms, I looked around the room, a small cube of a room whose walls were brown-painted metal. On the floor lay a queer little dead man. A little man in tight-fitting black velvet and silk. Black velvet blouse and breeches, black silk stockings and skullcap, black patent leather pumps. His face was small and old and bony, but smooth as stone, without line or wrinkle. A hole was in his blouse, where it fit high under his chin. The hole bled very slowly. The floor around him showed it had been bleeding faster a little while ago. Beyond him, a safe was open. Papers were on the floor in front of it, as if the safe had been tilted to spill them out. The girl moved against my arm. "You killed him?" I asked. "Yes, too faint to have been heard a yard away." "Why?" She shook her short brown hair out of her eyes with a tired jerk of her head. "Does it make any difference?" she asked. "I did kill him." "It might make a difference," I told her, taking my arm away and going over to shut the door. "People talk more freely in a room with a closed door. I happen to be in your father's employ. Mr. Reddy is a police detective. Of course, neither of us can smash any laws, but if you'll tell us what's what, maybe we can help you." "My father's employ?" she questioned. "Yes. When you and your sister disappeared, he engaged me to find you. We found your sister, and life came into her face and eyes and voice. I didn't kill Ruth," she cried. "The papers lied. I didn't kill her. I didn't know she had the revolver. I didn't know it. We were going away to hide from everything. We're stopped in the woods to burn those things." That's the first time I knew she had the revolver. We had talked about suicide at first, but I had persuaded her, thought I had persuaded her not to. I tried to take the revolver away from her, but I couldn't. She shot herself while I was trying to get it away. I tried to stop her. I didn't kill her. This was getting somewhere. "And then?" I encouraged her. "And then I went to Sacramento and left the car there and came back to San Francisco. Ruth told me she had written Raymond Elwood a letter. She told me that before I persuaded her not to kill herself. The first time. I tried to get the letter from Raymond. She had written him she was going to kill herself. I tried to get the letter, but Raymond said he had given it to Hador. So I came here this evening to get it. I had just found it when there was a lot of noise upstairs. Then Hador came in and found me. He bolted the door, and I shot him with the revolver that was in the safe. I shot him when he turned around, before he could say anything. It had to be that way, or I couldn't." "You mean you shot him without being threatened or attacked by him?" Pat asked. "Yes. I was afraid of him, afraid to let him speak. I hated him. I couldn't help it. It had to be that way. If he had talked, I couldn't have shot him. He wouldn't have let me." "Who was this Hador?" I asked. She looked away from Pat and me, at the walls, at the ceiling, at the queer little dead man on the floor. Chapter 10. He was A. She cleared her throat and started again, staring down at her feet. "Raymond Elwood brought us here the first time. We thought it was funny. But Haidar was a devil. He told you things and you believed them. You couldn't help it. He told you everything and you believed it. Perhaps we were drugged. There was always a warm, bluish wine. It must have been drugged. We couldn't have done those things if it hadn't. Nobody would. He called himself a priest of Al-Zoa. He taught a freeing of the spirit from the flesh by. Her voice broke huskily. She shuddered. It was horrible, she went on presently in the silence Pat and I had left for her. But you believed him. That is the whole thing. You can't understand it unless you understand that. The things he taught could not be so, but he said they were, and you believed you were. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe you pretended you believed them because you were crazy and drugs were in your blood. We came back again and again for weeks, months, before the disgust that had to come drove us away. We stopped coming, Ruth and I, and Irma, and then we found out what he was. He demanded money, more money than we had been paying while we believed, or pretended belief, in his cult. We couldn't give him the money he demanded. I told him we wouldn't. He sent us photographs of us, taken during the times here. They were pictures. You couldn't explain. And they were true. We knew them true. What could we do? He said he would send copies to our father, every friend, everyone we knew, unless we paid. What could we do, except pay? We got the money somehow. We gave him money. More. And then we had no more, could get no more. We didn't know what to do. There was nothing to do, except Ruth and Irma wanted to kill themselves. I thought of that too, but I persuaded Ruth not to. I said we'd go away. I'd take her away, keep her safe. And then this. She stopped talking, went on staring at her feet. I looked again at the little dead man on the floor, weird in his black cap and clothes. No more blood came from his throat. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. This dead Haidar, self-ordained priest of something or other, staging orgies under the alias of religious ceremonies. Elwood, his confederate, bringing women of family and wealth to him. A room lighted for photography with a concealed camera. Contributions from his converts so long as they were faithful to the cult. Blackmail, with the help of the photographs afterward. I looked from Haidar to Pat Reddy. He was scowling at the dead man. No sound came from outside the room. "You have the letter your sister wrote Elwood?" I asked the girl. Her hand flashed to her bosom and crinkled paper there. "Yes." "It says plainly she meant to kill herself?" "Yes." "That ought to square her with Contra Costa County," I said to Pat. He nodded his battered head. "It ought to," he agreed. "It's not likely that they could prove murder on her even without that letter. With it, they'll not take her into court. That's a safe bet. Another is that she won't have any trouble over this shooting. She'll come out of court free and thanked in the bargain." Myra Bambrock flinched away from Pat as if he had hit her in the face. I was her father's hired man just now. I saw her side of the affair. I lit a cigarette and studied what I could see of Pat's face through blood and grime. Pat is a right guy. "Listen, Pat," I wheedled him, though with a voice that was as if I were not trying to wheedle him at all. "Miss Bambrock can go into court and come out free and thanked, as you say. But to do it, she's got to use everything she knows. She's got to have all the evidence there is. She's got to use all those photographs Haidar took, or all we can find of them. Some of those pictures have sent women to suicide, Pat. At least 2 that we know. If Miss Bambrock goes into court, we've got to make the photographs of God knows show many other women public property. We've got to advertise things that will put Miss Bambrock, and you can't say how many other women and girls, in a position that at least 2 women have killed themselves to escape." Pat scowled at me and rubbed his dirty chin with a dirtier thumb. I took a deep breath and made my play. "Pat, you and I came here to question Raymond Elwood, having traced him here. Maybe we suspected him of being tied up with the mob that knocked over the St. Louis bank last month. Maybe we suspected him of handling the stuff that was taken from the mail cars in that stick-up near Denver week before last. Anyway, we were after him, knowing that he had a lot of money that came from nowhere and a real estate office that did no real estate business. We came here to question him in connection with one of these jobs I've mentioned. We were jumped by a couple of the shines upstairs when they found we were sleuths. The rest of it grew out of that. This religious cult business was just something we ran into and didn't interest us especially. So far as we knew, all these folks jumped us just through friendship for the man we were trying to question. Hador was one of them, and, tussling with you, you shot him with his own gun, which of course is the one Miss Banbrock found in the safe. Reddy didn't seem to like my suggestion at all. The eyes with which he regarded me were decidedly sour. "You're goofy," he accused me. "What'll that get anybody? That won't keep Miss Banbrock out of it. She's here, isn't she, and the rest of it will come out like thread off a spool." "But Miss Banbrock wasn't there," I explained. "Maybe the upstairs is full of coppers by now. Maybe not, anyway. You're going to take Miss Banbrock out of here and turn her over to Dick Foley, who will take her home. She's got nothing to do with this party. Tomorrow she and her father's lawyer and I will all go up to Martinez and make a deal with the prosecuting attorney of Contra Costa County. We'll show him how Ruth killed herself. If somebody happens to connect the Elwood, who I hope is dead upstairs with the Elwood who knew the girls and Mrs. Carell, what of it? If we keep out of court, as we'll do by convincing the Contra Costa people they can't possibly convict her of her sister's murder, we'll keep out of the newspapers and out of trouble." Pat hung fire, thumb still to chin. "Remember," I urged him, "it's not only Miss Banbrock we're doing this for. It's a couple of dead ones and a flock of live ones, who certainly got mixed up with Hador of their own accords, but who don't stop being human beings on that account." Pat shook his head stubbornly. "I'm sorry," I told the girl with faked hopelessness. "I've done all I can, but it's a lot to ask of Reddy. I don't know that I blame him for being afraid to take a chance on." "Pat is Irish. Don't be so damned quick to fly off," he snapped at me, cutting short my hypocrisy. "But why do I have to be the one that shot this Hador? Why not you?" "I had him." "Because," I explained, "you're a bull, and I'm not. There'll be less chance of a slip-up if he was shot by a bona fide, star-wearing, flat-footed officer of the peace. I killed most of those birds upstairs. You ought to do something to show you were here." That was only part of the truth. My idea was that if Pat took the credit, he couldn't very well ease himself out afterward, no matter what happened. Pat's a right guy, and I'd trust him anywhere. But you can trust a man just as easily if you have him sewed up. Pat grumbled and shook his head. "But I'm ruining myself, I don't doubt," he growled. "But I'll do it this once." "Attaboy." I went over to pick up the girl's hat from the corner in which it lay. "I'll wait here until you come back from turning her over to Dick." I gave the girl her hat and orders together. "You go to your home where the man Reddy turns you over to. Stay there until I come, which will be as soon as I can make it. Don't tell anybody anything, except that I told you to keep quiet. That includes your father. Tell him I told you not to tell him even where you saw me. Got it?" "Yes, and I. Gratitude is nice to think about afterward, but it takes time when there's work to be done." "Get going, Pat." They went. Chapter 11. As soon as I was alone with the dead man, I stepped over him and knelt in front of the safe, pushing letters and papers away, hunting for photographs. None was in sight. One compartment of the safe was locked. I frisked the corpse. No key. The locked compartment wasn't very strong, but neither am I the best safe burglar in the West. It took me a while to get into it. What I wanted was there, a thick sheaf of negatives, a stack of prints, 100 of them. I started to run through them, hunting for the Banbrock girls' pictures. I wanted to have them pocketed before Pat came back. I didn't know how much farther he would let me go. Luck was against me. and the time I had wasted getting into the compartment. He was back before I had got past the 6th print in the stack. Those 6 had been pretty bad. Well, that's done. Pat growled at me as he came into the room. Dick's got her. Elwood is dead, and so is the only one of the Negroes I saw upstairs. Everybody else seems to have beat it. No bulls have shown, so I put in a call for a wagonful. I stood up, holding the sheaf of negatives in one hand, the prints in the other. "What's all that?" he asked. I went after him again. "Photographs. You've just done me a big favor, Pat, and I'm not hoggish enough to ask another. But I'm going to put something in front of you, Pat. I'll give you the lay, and you can name it. These," I waved the pictures at him, "are Haddo's meal tickets, the photos he was either collecting on or planning to collect on. They're photographs of people, Pat, mostly women and girls, and some of them are pretty rotten. If tomorrow's papers say that a flock of photos were found in this house after the fireworks, there's going to be a fat suicide list in the next day's papers, and a fatter list of disappearances. If the papers say nothing about the photos, the lists may be a little smaller, but not much. Some of the people whose pictures are here know they are here. They will expect the police to come hunting for them. We know this much about the photographs. 2 women have killed themselves to get away from them. This is an armful of stuff that can dynamite a lot of people, Pat, and a lot of families, no matter which of those 2 ways the papers read. But, suppose, Pat, the papers say that just before you shot Hador, he succeeded in burning a lot of pictures and papers, burning them beyond recognition. Isn't it likely, then, that there won't be any suicides? That some of the disappearances of recent months may clear themselves up? There. She is, Pat. You name it. Looking back, it seems to me I had come a lot nearer being eloquent than ever before in my life. But Pat didn't applaud. He cursed me. He cursed me thoroughly, bitterly, and with an amount of feeling that told me I had won another point in my little game. He called me more things than I ever listened to before from a man who was built of meat and bone, and who therefore could be smacked. When he was through, we carried the papers and photographs and a small book of addresses we found in the safe into the next room, and fed them to the little round iron stove there. The last of them was ash before we heard the police overhead. "That's absolutely all," Pat declared when we got up from our work. "Don't ever ask me to do anything else for you if you live to be 1,000. "That's absolutely all," I echoed. I like Pat. He's a right guy. The 6th photograph in the stack had been of his wife, the coffee importer's reckless, hot-eyed daughter. End of The Scorched Face by Dashiell Hammett.